Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. The first time I realized this lake might actually save me, I was standing on a public dock, watching the wind push chop against the pilings while my phone vibrated in my pocket with alerts I didn't bother opening. Sirens were screaming from the highway behind the trees and people were shouting somewhere up the shore, but out on the water, everything looked dead calm. My name is Tate Winslow. I handle surveys and maintenance around this lake and a few others in the chain. That means checking water levels, walking the shorelines, and fixing headaches before the guys in the office even hear about them. I know every cove and rocky point on this side. But I also know one thing most people don't, which is that there is a small island near the far shore that never made it onto the maps the Park Service hands out to tourists. I broke ground on a cabin out there 3 summers ago, working weekends and days off when I needed to get out of town. No power lines, no road, no neighbors. Just a hump of granite with some scrub trees on it, and enough flat ground for a 12 by 16 frame. I did most of it alone, hauling lumber in a beat-up aluminum boat with a motor older than I was. A few friends came out once, took some pictures, got bored, and never asked to go again. That was fine by me. See, the island doesn't show up on phone apps. If you scan the lake on a screen, it looks like open water. On my paper charts, though, it is a tiny bump with no name and a pencil note I made years ago. Shallow shelf, good anchor, no traffic. When the news started talking about riots and an infection in the city, my first thought wasn't about hospitals or shelters. My first thought was simple. Water slows down everything that walks. Sirens used to be a rare thing out here before that week. A speeder on the county road or maybe a brush fire during a dry spell, but that was it. That evening, though, they didn't stop. One wailed past, then another, and then a third with that dropping tone I'd only ever heard during storm evacuations. My phone was buzzing against my hip like an angry hornet while I tied the boat to the dock, vibrating with alerts I didn't have the stomach to open. The lock screen showed the headlines I'd been trying to ignore all day. Grainy clips from overseas of people in torn clothes and bare feet, faces slick with blood, security cameras catching bodies getting back up when they should have stayed down. The news anchors called it an outbreak, but they always made it sound like it was happening somewhere else. That day, though, there were no calm faces left on the screen. Just shaky video and red crawl bars that screamed state of emergency and stay indoors. The funny thing was, the Home Office acted like the old world was still spinning that afternoon. They sent a generic message about checking water levels at a few feeder streams after last week's rain. Nothing about the infection, nothing about the riots, just normal tasks written by people who still believed the rules held. So I played along. I took the small aluminum boat, ran the near shore, took photos, and sent notes whenever the signal held long enough to push data through. But by the time the sun started to drop, calls were ringing once and cutting out. Texts stacked up as sending without ever going through. A patrol car rolled into the public launch while I was checking the outboard and shaking the fuel cans. 2 deputies stepped out looking like they hadn't slept in 2 days, radios turned up loud and crackling with static. One walked to the end of the dock and just stared at the water like he wished he could walk across it. The other leaned on the hood of the cruiser and watched me, then called out, "Launch closes hard at dark. You got much left to do?" I kept my hands where he could see them and said, "Just tying up." He shook his head, spat on the gravel, and said, "City just announced shelters. They're telling people not to travel unless they absolutely have to. Hospitals are locking their doors. Dispatch keeps saying to stay away from anyone acting confused or aggressive. You see anything weird on the water, you call it in, you hear me?" The word shelter landed hard. Around here, that didn't mean safety. It meant high school gyms full of cots and anxious families, pallets of lukewarm bottled water, lines for bathrooms, and strangers breathing the same recycled air all night. That picture felt worse than whatever was happening in the dark. I asked, "You think it's that bad up here already?" His radio cracked and a frantic voice mentioned the highway. He grimaced and said, "Bad enough? Pile-ups, fights, people running straight into traffic. We're chaining this gate when we leave. If you're going anywhere, do it now and do it once." His partner came back from the end of the dock, looking pale, and asked, "You planning to sleep out there or heading in?" Nothing like a full plan existed in my head yet, just jagged pieces, the cabin, the island, food, fuel. How many trips I could make before the light died. I said, "Heading in. I'll be gone before you lock it." The first deputy pointed a finger at me and said, "Do it fast, and if you got family in town, tell them to stay put and lock their doors." They left the chain loose, got back in the car, and peeled away with their light bar flashing. Up the hill, the small store and bait shop had every bulb on and every pump running. Miller, the owner, stood out front with his phone in a white-knuckled grip and said, "You seeing this on TV, Tate?" I said, "Phone's showing enough. Power still good in there?" He nodded, eyes glued to the screen, and said, "For now. My brother's near the city. Says people are breaking into pharmacies in broad daylight. You want gas? Fill it now." Filling the truck felt like one more chore, but my hands moved faster than usual, adrenaline making me clumsy with the nozzle. Tank first, then a couple of jerry cans for the boat. Inside the store, I grabbed what I could carry without looking like a looter. Canned soup, beans, rice, peanut butter, coffee, matches, and a couple of cheap lighters. I grabbed a handful of batteries too, just in case. At the counter, Miller kept one eye on the news and said, "They keep saying don't panic, but they never say what to do instead." I paid cash. Credit felt like a promise that wouldn't be kept, and told him, "Lock up when you have to, Miller." Between town and the small lake house where I kept most of my gear, the first thing I couldn't explain showed up in the ditch. A pickup lay on its side, nose down, rear wheels still turning slowly in the air. The windshield looked punched out from the inside, shattered outward. No driver stood on the shoulder, no one waved for help, no hazard lights blinked. Just the truck and a streak of dark fluid across the gravel that looked too thick to be oil. Every instinct from my regular life screamed to stop, check the cab, call it in. But another voice spoke clear and cold in the back of my head, saying that walking up blind was exactly how the people in those videos died. The patrol car had given me enough rules for the night. Avoid contact. Stay away from anyone acting wrong. Do not add your name to the list of the dead. The wheel stayed straight in my hands as I drove past the wreck. Plan or no plan, one idea settled into place like a heavy stone. Get to the house. Load the boat. Reach the island before dark. Whatever this outbreak turned into on the roads and in the city, out on the water, I still had one spot that nobody else knew about. And right now, that was more than most people had. By the time I swung the truck into the gravel drive at the lake house, the light over the trees was already bleeding out, turning from gray to a bruised purple. The place was small, more of a glorified shed than a home, but it backed right onto the water, and right now, that was the only real estate that mattered. The aluminum boat sat on its side on the dock, motor mounted on a stand, just waiting. I parked tight against the door, nose out, so I could move fast if I changed my mind or if something came down the driveway behind me. The radio in the cab was spitting out pieces of terrified sentences. Quarantine, shelters opening immediately. Reports of violence near level 1 trauma centers. Stay inside. Avoid contact. No one sounded calm anymore. It didn't feel like advice. It sounded like people shouting while a tidal wave rolled over them. Inside, the house smelled like stale dust and old coffee. Through the window, the lake looked dull and flat, completely ordinary. The only thing different was how it felt to look at it. Like the water was the only barrier left. I dropped the grocery bags on the kitchen table and went straight to the hall closet. That was where I kept the gear that made more sense on the island than it did here. I pulled out 2 sleeping bags rated for 0 degrees, a solid trauma kit I'd built myself, a hand crank radio that looked like a toy but worked when the grid died, a single burner camp stove with a stack of fuel canisters, and a box of water filters I had never bothered to test. All of it went into a heavy canvas duffel, jammed in with wool socks, thermal shirts, reinforced work pants, leather gloves, and a knit hat. Late fall on this lake was no joke. If I got stuck out there with the wrong clothes, the infection wouldn't have to work very hard to kill me. Hypothermia would beat it to the punch. In the kitchen, I stopped pretending I might be back in a couple of days. This wasn't a weekend trip. I went for the canned food first, anything with a stamped date a year or more out. Beans, heavy soups, vegetables, spam, tuna, stewed tomatoes. Rice and pasta followed, calories that packed tight. Coffee and salt went in on instinct. I grabbed a bottle of generic multivitamins because a medic in town had once told me that people fall apart faster than they think when their diet turns into nothing but cans and starch. The phone on the counter lit up and vibrated with the jagged, jarring tone I had only ever heard during tornado warnings. An emergency alert pushed through the dead data and dropped calls. Statewide public health emergency. Shelters open at listed locations. Curfew effective immediately. Hospitals at capacity. Avoid all contact with individuals exhibiting confusion or aggression. It urged citizens to remain indoors and await instructions. It didn't say how long those instructions would take to arrive, or if anyone was even left to write them. I stood there and pictured the high school gym. Rows of cots pushed cot to cot, lines stretching out the bathrooms, hundreds of people pacing with phones held up trying to catch a signal. I pictured one person in that room who had been bitten an hour ago and didn't want to admit it, sweating under a Red Cross blanket, telling everyone they just felt a little tired. That was all it would take, a petri dish with basketball hoops. Once they bolted those doors, you were in a box with strangers and no exit plan. The island didn't have lights or doctors or backup. It didn't have walls someone else had inspected or safety rules printed on laminated signs. But it had a ring of deep cold water and a cabin frame I had built myself, far enough from shore that nothing on two legs could reach it without showing itself the whole way. That seemed like a hell of a better bet than a folding cot in a crowded room. I turned the phone off, not just screen off, but powered down completely. I slid it into a kitchen drawer. If I kept it on, someone would call and ask for a ride or a favor, and the human part of me would try to say yes. The networks were choking anyway. No signal also meant no easy way for anyone to track where I went. I had let apps follow me for years, trading privacy for convenience. Tonight I decided I was done feeding the machine. In the bedroom, I pulled up the corner of the rug in the closet and opened the small floor safe. Two guns came out, carrying more weight in my mind than they did in my hands. A bolt-action .308 rifle with a decent scope and 3 full boxes of soft-point rounds. About 60 shots if I made them count. Beside it, a .45 pistol with 3 loaded magazines and 2 extra boxes of hollow points I'd stashed years ago. Both had been cleaned and oiled after the last time I took them to the range. I checked the chambers, made sure the actions were smooth, then slipped them into padded cases with a small bottle of REM oil and a rag. Every drawer after that got the same ruthless question: will this keep me alive out there? Duct tape went into a plastic tote, nylon rope, a headlamp and a brick of batteries, a cheap pair of walkie-talkies I had bought for a fishing trip and never really used. Maybe useless, maybe a way to listen. A manual can opener, the old crank style. I threw that in because I had watched a neighbor try to open a can with a steak knife once when the power went out, slicing his hand open, and I had promised myself I would never be that unprepared. Civilization ends the moment you can't open your own food. When the tote was full and I couldn't think of one more useful thing, I stopped looking. Loading the truck took 3 fast, sweaty passes. Duffel and tote into the bed, guns tucked behind the bench seat in the cab, fuel cans last. I tied everything down with a trucker's hitch I could undo in a hurry. Sirens carried over the trees from the highway and from town across the water, a constant background wail. Somewhere closer to the city, a helicopter beat the air, the thump, thump, thump of its rotors vibrating in my chest. None of those sounds pointed to any place I wanted to drive toward. The road from the house to the small cove where I kept the boat was 10 minutes on a normal day. That night, the drive felt fragile, like the asphalt itself might crack open. I drove with one eye on the rear view and one on the ditches. A minivan hurtled toward the highway doing well over 80, crossing the center line. A sedan sat stalled half on the shoulder with its hazard lights ticking against the dark trees. No driver, no movement. That was enough warning for me. I didn't slow down. I pressed the gas and headed for the water. The lane to the cove dipped sharply toward the water, winding between the skeletal shapes of bare trees before ending abruptly at a strip of gravel and an old, weather-beaten dock. My aluminum boat sat on the rollers exactly where I had left it. Dull paint, patched seams bow pointed at the lake like a compass needle. I parked the truck close to the dock, killed the engine, and just listened for a moment. The silence was heavy. The only sound was the wind pushing small, choppy waves against the mudbank. No birds, no traffic, just the water. There was no point in sitting in the cab. I dropped the tailgate, the metal clanging too loud in the quiet, and hauled the fuel cans out, lining them up by the water's edge. I ran a hand along the boat's hull. It was dry and solid. It wasn't pretty. It had dents from years of work. But it floated, and right now, buoyancy was the only thing that mattered. The outboard went onto the transom with motions I had done 1,000 times in my sleep. Clamp, tighten, check the safety chain, connect the fuel line, squeeze the primer bulb until it went hard. I slid the heavy duffel under the middle bench seat to keep the weight centered, stacked the food crates and toolboxes forward, and laid the rifle case carefully along the floorboards where it wouldn't get wet. The .45 stayed on my belt, heavy and reassuring. Before I launched, I backed the truck deep into the trees beside the lane, forcing it back until pine branches brushed against the doors and the bumper was buried in brush. I killed the dome light, locked it out of habit, and pocketed the keys. If I ever came back, it would still be there. If I didn't, well, someone would eventually score a free truck. At the dock, I pushed the boat down the guides. Aluminum scraped against wood until it eased into the water and floated free, bobbing slightly. Stepping off the dock always felt like a small risk, a shift in balance. Tonight, it felt like a line I wasn't going to cross twice. I untied the bowline, put one boot on the center seat, and shoved off hard with the other. I waited until I drifted 10 yards out before I pulled the cord. The old motor sputtered, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and settled into a rough, familiar idle. I turned the bow toward a dark, shapeless mass on the far side of the lake. The island sat out from the main shore like a low hump of shadow, too small for a house and too awkward for a campground. Perfect. As soon as I cleared the protection of the cove, the air temperature dropped. It felt raw. I pulled my knit hat down over my ears and zipped my jacket to the chin. The lights from the houses on the main shore slid past in my peripheral vision. Warm squares of yellow that signaled families, dinners, TV screens. I turned my back on them and watched them drop behind the curve of the land. The sirens dulled to a background hum. No other engines crossed the water. I was the only thing moving. Halfway across, I eased off the throttle to keep the noise down and scanned the dark for other boats. Nothing. The lake was a black mirror. I was heading the other way into the void. The island grew from a smudge into a real shape. On the front side, facing the town, it was just a wall of rock and tangled trees, but on the back side, a narrow cut opened into an inlet you couldn't see from open water unless you were right on top of it. I had found it years back while chasing a drifting marker buoy and had marked it on my paper chart with a star. I cut the motor 50 yards out and let the boat glide into the inlet on momentum. Silence rushed back in as the engine died. When the aluminum keel scraped against stone, I stepped into the shallows and dragged the bow up until the hull rested clear of the wash. The water was icy, seeping through the laces of my boots, but it was only ankle deep. I tied the bowline to a thick exposed root and stood there for a moment, breathing steam into the chill air, listening to the water lap against the aluminum. The cabin sat 20 yards in from the landing, up a short, steep rise between two massive pines. 12 by 16 feet, single room, galvanized metal roof, rough plank walls. There was a porch with 2 steps I had never gotten around to fixing and a steel chimney capping the stove corner. I had framed it one weekend at a time, hauling lumber from town board by board. Up close in the dark, it looked smaller than I remembered. Vulnerable. The door was closed. The heavy padlock on the hasp sat exactly where I had left it 3 weeks ago. The dirt around the steps held old prints, fallen pine needles, and a dusting of frost. No new tracks, no broken branches. It was empty. I unlocked the padlock, the click sounding like a gunshot, and pushed inside. The air smelled of dry pine, dust, and cold iron. A narrow cot sat against the far wall. Simple shelves in the corner held a few rows of cans from past trips, relics from a time when this was just a hobby. A table, 2 chairs, and a couple of unlit lanterns shared the space with the cast-iron stove in the corner. Gray ash from the last fire still sitting cold under the grate. Light discipline came first. Before I struck a match, I went to the windows. I swung the heavy wooden shutters down and slid the internal latches home. That stopped the wind, and it would hide the firelight from anyone watching on the shore. Only then did I turn to the heat. I dropped the duffel on the cot and went to the wood stack behind the cabin. Split logs and kindling sat under a tarp, dry and ready. I carried an armload inside, crumpled old newspaper from a crate, and built a fire in the stove. 1 match later, the paper caught, the orange glow flaring up, and then the kindling crackled. I closed the iron door and adjusted the damper. A few minutes later, the first real warmth began to radiate into the room, thawing my hands. While the fire took hold, I walked the room and checked the seams. No water stains on the ceiling, no daylight showing through the walls. But the weak spots were obvious. 2 windows on the long walls and a small one near the stove had always been for the morning view. Tonight, they were just holes in my armor. In the corner, I had a stack of spare lumber left over from the porch work. I grabbed my cordless drill from the tool bag, thank God I'd charged the batteries last month, and a box of 3-inch deck screws. I cut the boards to length with a handsaw, the rasping sound seeming too loud in the small room. Then I screwed 3 heavy planks across each window on the inside. I didn't use a hammer. The banging would have carried across the water like a dinner bell. The drill whirred low and steady as the screws bit into the wood. The boards wouldn't stop a truck, but they would slow a body down and make a hell of a lot of noise if someone tried to come through. The door got the same treatment. The deadbolt still turned, but I wouldn't trust a $10 lock with my life. I set heavy steel brackets into the wall studs on either side of the frame, drove the screws in deep, and slid a thick 4x4 plank through to make a drop bar. With that in place, anyone trying the door would have to take the whole wall down to get in. By the time I set the plank, the stove was throwing real heat. The metal roof ticked as it warmed up. I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off my wet boots and socks, setting them near the stove to dry. I pulled on thick wool socks from the duffel and flexed my toes until the pins and needles faded. My hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. The rush of moving, driving, and loading was gone, leaving just the silence of the island. I looked around the small room. Shadows danced on the walls from the stove vents. I started a mental list: water, more food, better insulation, a designated corner for waste and washing so I don't pollute the site, ways to hear if something steps onto the island while I sleep. For tonight, the cabin was just a warm box with a locked door and a gun on the table. But starting tomorrow, it had to become a fortress. It had to become the machine that kept me alive. Morning broke gray and bitter. Light pushed through the thin gaps around the window boards and dusty slanting beams. For a split second, I woke up thinking I was back in my bedroom at the lake house, late for a shift, searching for the alarm clock. Then my eyes adjusted to the dim light and I saw the heavy wooden bar dropped across the door and the cold iron stove in the corner. The memory hit me like a physical weight. I wasn't home. I had chosen the island over everything else, and the old world was gone. I threw off the sleeping bag, shivering as the cold air clamped down on me. I opened the stove door, fed 2 pieces of split oak onto the dying red coals, and watched until the flames licked up and took hold. Heat wasn't just comfort anymore. Heat was the only thing standing between me and freezing to death. Water was next on the list. 2 plastic jugs sat in the corner, leftovers from old weekend trips, but they wouldn't last long. The lake waded just down the slope, black and flat between the pine trunks. At this point, I trusted that lake water more than anything coming out of a city pipe, but I still wasn't about to drink it raw. One stomach bug out here could dehydrate me fast enough to kill me. I dug through a plastic bin under the shelf where I kept old camping gear. Buried under a tangle of nylon rope and a rolled-up rain jacket, I found a box of hand pump filters I had bought on sale 2 years ago and never opened. I took the filter and 2 empty jugs down to the inlet. The air had teeth this morning, biting at my exposed face. I stepped into the water up to my shins, the cold instantly penetrating my boots, and filled both jugs where the lake ran clean over the granite shelf. Back in the cabin, I set 1 jug on the table, dropped the intake hose into it, and started pumping into the second jug. The rhythm was steady, swish-clack, as clear water ran into clean plastic. It wasn't laboratory grade, but it was a solid layer between me and whatever bacteria lived in the untreated water. I put a pot of that filtered water on top of the stove and brought it to a rolling boil. Between the ceramic filter and the heat, it would have to be enough. Once water and fire were handled for the moment, the walls started to bother me. Bare pine boards with a thin layer of tar paper behind them had been fine for summer nights. They were not fine for late fall, and they sure as hell wouldn't hold up against a winter where no one was coming to plow roads or keep the power grid humming. The floor was the same story, cold pressing up through every gap between the planks. I didn't have rolls of pink fiberglass insulation stacked in a corner, but I did have resources. I pulled down thick moving blankets, an old heavy canvas tarp, and 2 thin rugs I had stored in the rafters. I went to work with a staple gun, tacking the blankets and tarp across the inside of the exterior walls, leaving a careful bare zone around the stove so nothing would catch fire. When I was done, it looked like I was living inside a padded cell, lined with mismatched fabrics, but the drafts dropped right away. The rugs went down around the cot and the table so my feet weren't resting straight on cold wood. Small fixes done with what I had, but the room held heat 10 times better after an hour of work. While I moved around with the staple gun, the small crank radio on the shelf spat static and fragments of a voice. Most stations were just dead air. The ones still alive were reading the same script on a loop. Stay indoors. Go to listed shelters. Avoid anyone acting confused or aggressive. Report attacks. Wait for further instructions. Out here, there were no listed shelters. There were no scrolling numbers at the bottom of a TV screen. There was no patrol car to call if something started banging on the door. That realization was terrifying and simple at the same time. No one was coming. Anything that changed about my situation would be because I changed it. By midday, I had a rough survival list burned into my head. Heat, water, food, and waste. Heat came from the stove as long as I kept swinging the axe. Water came from the lake, filtered and boiled. Food was in cans and bags for now, but there was a hard limit printed on every label. Waste meant I had to stop pretending this was just an extended fishing trip. In the summer, I used to dig a shallow hole in the trees and call it good. That might work for a weekend. It wouldn't work for months with a person living in a space this small. Sanitation kills you just as dead as a bullet if you get it wrong. Behind the cabin, the ground dropped off toward a patch of thick brush. I picked a dry spot there, framed a small square with scrap 2x4s, and set a heavy plastic crate with the bottom cut out over the middle. A toilet seat I had once brought out here as a gag gift for a buddy finally earned its place on top of that crate. I dug a deep pit under it, lined the upper edge with flat stones so the sandy soil wouldn't cave in, and set a simple plywood lid over the seat to keep bugs and smells down. A 5-gallon bucket beside it held a mix of dirt and old wood shavings from past projects, with a small plastic scoop on top. Do your business, cover it with dirt, close the lid. It was crude, but it kept the waste in one place and away from the cabin and the water source. Back inside, I laid every bit of food I had on the table and took inventory. Cans of beans, soup, mixed vegetables, stewed tomatoes, and tuna. Bags of white rice and pasta. 2 jars of peanut butter. Coffee, salt, sugar, and that cheap bottle of multivitamins. Spread out like that, it looked like a feast. Then I started doing the math, dividing it by days, and the pile shrank in my mind. I set simple rules immediately. 2 real meals a day. No eating just because I was anxious or bored. Anything with real protein, tuna, spam, beans was a bonus, not something to burn through without thinking. Once I could fish without drawing eyes from every shore, the lake would help feed me. Until then, every can and every cup of rice had to count. None of that meant much if the infection reached me. I needed to know who and what was moving around the lake perimeter. By mid-afternoon, with the stove holding steady and the cabin actually feeling warm, I grabbed a small pair of binoculars and climbed the tallest pine near the inlet. The bark was rough and cold under my hands, scraping my knuckles. Halfway up, I found a fork in the branches with a clear view through the needles. From there, I could scope the public launch on one side, a line of expensive docks on this shore, and a strip of sand where a side road touched the far bank. The town looked wrong, even from this distance. It looked hollowed out. Only one thin thread of smoke rose from a single chimney in a neighborhood of 50 houses. No one walked the docks. No fishing boats cut white wake lines across the water. The highway noise, usually a constant hum, was thin now. Just a few desperate engines revving out there in the silence. It was the quiet that scared me the most. On the third morning, the lake lay flat and dull, a gray sheet of hammered iron with a thin layer of mist drifting over the surface. Heavy frost coated the porch rail, and the air felt like broken glass in my throat when I stepped outside to check the perimeter. I fed the stove to keep the coals alive, drank a mug of hot water mixed with instant coffee, and then took the rifle and the binoculars to climb the pine again. Guessing about what was happening on the shore had been fine for the first 2 days, but from now on I needed to see it with my own eyes. From the fork in the branches, I had a command view of the public launch, the row of silent houses and a bare strip of rocky bank on the east side. The launch was still chained and empty. Most houses showed no smoke, looking like dead teeth in a jaw. Nothing moved for an hour until a single figure came into view along the east bank, walking precariously on the slick rocks just above the drop-off into deeper water. At first I thought it was another dead one, a straggler, but the steps were too careful, and the head kept snapping back to check the trail behind. I brought the glass up and focused. It was a woman, small frame, wearing a dark jacket and a pack with straps pulled tight across her chest. Her hair was tied back and she was moving with desperate purpose. Behind her, maybe 30 yards up the slope where the woods met the shore, 3 shufflers walked in a loose, staggering line. They didn't run, but they didn't wander aimlessly either. They had a scent or a sightline. Every time she slowed to navigate a wet rock or stumbled on driftwood, they ate a little more of the distance. There was no one else on that stretch of shore to help her. If she tripped and stayed down for more than 10 seconds, they would be on top of her. For a few heartbeats, I sat there with the rifle across my lap and told myself this wasn't my problem. My rules were simple. No contact meant no new variables, no risk of infection inside the cabin. But then she slipped on a patch of loose shale, dropped hard to one knee, and had to scramble with both hands to get back up. That was enough. I cursed under my breath, climbed down fast, grabbed the small marine air horn off the shelf in case I needed a loud diversion, stuffed it in my jacket pocket, and ran for the inlet. I grabbed the paddle and worked the boat silently toward a short point of stone that stuck a few yards out into the lake. Beyond it, the bottom dropped off fast into deep water. If she could reach that point and jump, she would be in water too deep for them to stand, but she'd freeze if I didn't pull her out fast. I stood up in the boat just enough to show my silhouette against the sky and waved an arm. When she glanced my way, eyes wide with panic, I put my voice out across the water, low but hard, and said, "Down here by the rocks. Come straight to me and get into the water. Don't stop to fight them on the bank." She didn't hesitate. She hit the last row of stones in a clumsy, desperate half-jump, arms wide for balance, boots skidding on moss. She dropped to one knee in the shallows, grabbed the gunwale of the boat, and my hand closed around her forearm. The weight nearly pulled me off balance, but the aluminum hull took the brunt of it, and she tumbled into the boat in a wet heap, pack and all. I shoved off hard with the paddle, putting 10 feet of dark water between us and the rocks before I even touched the motor. The woman sat up, coughing and dragging the heavy pack straighter, her breath loud and ragged in the cold air. I kept my eyes locked on the bank and said, "I need to know right now. Any bites, deep scratches, anything that broke the skin in the last 24 hours." She shook her head violently, still catching her breath, and answered, "No bite, no scratch. Just blisters and a long walk. I've been moving since before sunrise to get away from the highway." When 20 yards of safety sat between us and the shore, I pulled the starter cord and brought the motor back to life at low speed. She watched the 3 shufflers reach the water's edge. They paced the rocks, staring at us with dead, milky eyes, but they wouldn't enter the deep water. She looked at them, then turned to me and asked, "You live out here? Or are we both doing the same dumb thing on the same morning?" I kept one hand on the tiller, steering us toward the hidden inlet, and said, "I built a cabin on a rock nobody else wanted. Right now, that's the safest bad idea I've got. Name's Tate Winslow, you." She pushed wet, matted hair off her face and said, "Nora Vance. I test lake water and tap samples when the lab's open and the world's pretending everything's fine. The city went sideways 2 days ago. I took back roads up here because I thought the lake might be quiet. It was until those 3 came out of a backyard and locked onto me." I nodded, keeping the boat steady, and said, "Quiet doesn't mean empty anymore. Look, as long as you stay honest about bites and blood, you're welcome by the fire. You lie to me, we're both finished." She held my eyes for a second. She looked exhausted, scared but sharp, and then looked back at the shrinking shoreline and said, "No lies. I'm not dragging this infection into the only dry room I've seen since I ditched my car." We slipped back into the inlet, and the trees and rock around the island cut us off from the rest of the lake, wrapping us in silence again. I tied the bowline, helped her onto the small strip of shore, and led the way up the rise. The cabin sat there with its boarded windows and a thin, reassuring line of smoke drifting from the chimney. It still looked like something I had built for weekends, a rough shack, but now it was 4 solid walls and a bar on the door. Inside, I dropped the heavy wooden bar back into its slots and pointed at the cot. "Pack off, wet layers off, feet by the stove," I said. Then opened the iron door and fed the fire-dry wood until it roared. She shrugged out of the pack, peeled off her soaked jacket and outer shirt, and sat so close to the heat that steam started to rise from her damp sleeves. Up close, her face showed exactly how far she had pushed it. Dark circles under her eyes, lips a little blue from the water and the wind chill. She looked like she was vibrating with residual adrenaline. That afternoon, we didn't rest. We worked. We dragged spare boards in from the pile behind the cabin and cut a second layer for each window, screwing them in from the inside with just a thin horizontal slit left at eye height in one of them for observation. Nora followed behind me with strips of old wool blanket, tacking them over every gap where daylight showed. I pulled the door bar down, cut deeper pockets into the frame studs with a chisel, and set heavy metal brackets so it couldn't jump free if someone, or something, hit the door hard from the outside. We moved the small table away from the front wall and built a low brace out of scrap lumber across the room that could hold a rifle steady without wobble. By dark, the cabin felt different. It held heat better. The door felt solid as a bank vault when I leaned my weight into it, and the windows looked more like real barricades than an afterthought. 2 mugs of hot water sat on the table, 2 pairs of boots steamed by the stove, and the list in my head shifted from survive tonight to make this hold through the first snow. Nora watched the fire for a long time, the light dancing on her face, and finally looked up and said, "If nobody else knows this place is here, we might actually have a shot at riding this out." I answered, "That's the plan. If the island stays a blank spot on everyone's map, it stays ours." With Nora on the island, the daily grind shifted from a scramble into a disciplined routine. She walked the cabin with a black marker, hunting down every draft like it was a personal enemy, marking the gaps and telling me we would regret each one when the real Canadian cold rolled down. I cut and stacked wood until my shoulders burned, tightened the door bar, and kept the stove running low to conserve fuel. We split the day into hard shifts. One of us climbed the pine with binoculars to freeze in the wind, while the other handled water, food inventory, and small repairs. Nora was better at watching. She had a scientist's patience. She could track the highway, the silent docks, and the empty houses, then sit down and tell me exactly how many bodies had moved and how many chimneys still smoked. Most days she just wrote "no change" in a small spiral notebook and underlined it twice. Sometimes she added a short note about a trail of shufflers or a caller that had settled near a parking lot, screaming its broken noise until it pulled others in. Once, we both watched a ripper sprint down a side street, hit a stalled car hard enough to rock it on its springs, vanish from sight, and then climb back up to keep running. The flat, heavy stamp of its feet carried over the water, staying in our heads as a sound we would never ignore. About a week after she arrived, the lake carried something new. Near mid-afternoon, the wind shifted and brought faint shouts from the direction of the old marina on the far shore. A few seconds later, a scream cut across the water and didn't stop clean. It gurgled out. We grabbed the rifle and binoculars, ran down to the inlet, and climbed to the low rock that gave us a clear firing line. The marina was a strip of rotting slips and a few big fiberglass hulls that nobody was paying for anymore. Now, a thin line of black smoke rose from the main dock. Through the glass, I saw one man on his feet, one body down and unmoving, and 3 dead ones closing in. The standing man shoved a small John boat off the dock, tried to jump in, missed his step on the slick wood, and went straight into the freezing water. The boat rolled, dumped whatever gear was inside, and drifted away while he caught the overturned hull with both arms, kicking hard, but barely moving. On the dock, the 3 dead reached the edge and stopped. 2 moved like shufflers, slow and crooked. The third shifted its weight like a sprinter stuck behind a starting line, head snapping at every splash. A ripper. The only thing holding it back was the deep drop off the end of the boards. We watched for a slow count of 10. The man in the water wasn't sinking yet, but the cold and the panic were going to take him long before he could swim a mile. Nora kept her eyes glued to the dock and said, "If we leave him, he freezes right there, or he climbs back up and they tear him apart." I checked the perimeter of the marina for more movement and answered, "If we go out, anyone alive on that shore sees exactly where we came from. We can't haul every stranger into the boat, Nora." She let that sit for a second, kept looking through the glass, and said, "Right now it is 1 man and 3 dead things on rotten planks, and none of them can swim. You have the motor, I can work a rope, and if it goes sideways, we cut the line and come home. I'd want somebody to do that math for me if I was the one in the water." She wasn't pushing for drama. She hadn't argued when I set the hard rules about food, water, and bite checks. She asked because she had weighed the risk and still saw a line that made sense. I nodded and said, "We go fast. No stepping onto the dock. No shooting unless we have no choice. We pull him over the side and bring him here. If he's bitten or lying, he goes back in before we hit shallow water." Nora racked the bolt on her carbine and said, "Fair enough." We grabbed the rifle, 2 coils of heavy rope, and the small air horn, then pushed the boat off the rocks and let it drift into the channel before she started the motor. Nora brought the speed up just enough to eat the distance without throwing a long trail of engine noise that would echo off the hills. The man in the water saw us coming and started yelling, wasting energy, so I waved an arm and shouted, "Save your breath and keep your arms on that hull. We aren't fishing you out twice." As we came close, the 3 on the dock turned to face us. The shufflers shuffled to the edge, reaching out with slow, gray hands. The ripper paced 3 short steps and 3 back, feet hammering the planks in a hard, flat rhythm. It leaned forward like it might force itself to drop, then pulled back again, stuck between hunger and the line where the wood ended. We closed in, the boat rocking in the chop. I kept the rifle trained on the ripper while Nora killed the throttle and threw a line. It landed across the man's shoulder, but his hands were too frozen to grip it. He was blue-lipped, shivering so hard the water rippled around him. He yelled, "The case! Grab the case!" I looked and saw a black waterproof hard case floating next to him, tethered to his belt by a nylon strap. I shouted, "Forget the gear, grab the rope!" But he screamed back, "It's the guns, the ammo, take it!" Nora didn't argue. She leaned over the gunwale, risking her balance, and snagged the strap of the case, hauling it over the side with a heavy thud. Then she grabbed the back of the man's jacket. I slung the rifle and moved to help her. "On three," I grunted. "1, 2, 3. We heaved and he tumbled into the aluminum hull, coughing up water, shaking uncontrollably. On the dock, the Ripper let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal and crouched as if to jump. I grabbed the tiller and gunned the engine. The boat surged away, leaving the marina and the monsters in our wake. On the ride back, the man lay in the bottom of the boat, hugging the hard case like a child. I shouted over the motor, "Check him, Nora." She scanned his hands and neck from a safe distance. "No bites visible," she yelled back. I looked at the stranger and said, "I'm Tate, that's Nora. You bring any surprises in that box?" He looked up, teeth chattering, and tapped the black case. "Rhett," he stammered. "And yeah, a Mossberg shotgun and 3 boxes of shells. I wasn't leaving them for the dead." That was the moment I knew he'd fit in. He was half frozen, nearly drowned, but he'd saved the ammo. Smoke on the north shore was the first sign that the lake wasn't just ours anymore. At first, it was just one thin gray line rising from the picnic area above a shallow bay where families used to grill burgers in July. I watched it from the pine and told myself it might be one straggling family burning the last of their charcoal. But the smoke came back the next day and the next, thicker and darker. Trucks began to cluster along the access road, nose to tail, forming a jagged wall of metal instead of sitting scattered and empty like before. Through the glass, I started counting bodies around that fire, 4 at first, then more each day, moving between blue tarps and picnic tables they had dragged into a rough defensive ring. Every morning, a scavenger crew left the loop with empty packs. Every afternoon, they came back hauling blankets, red fuel cans, and cardboard boxes. More of the parked cars sat with doors hanging open and glass smashed out. Nora watched them write in her notebook and said, "They aren't waiting for help anymore. They're stripping the carcass. They're taking anything that keeps them standing for one more day. We started calling them the shore camp. On paper, they were doing exactly what we were doing, just with more people and a lot more noise. But the difference was simple geometry. We had 4 tight, insulated walls on a rock nobody had cared about. They had numbers, big wasteful fires, and shelves they were chewing through in plain sight of our side of the lake. If they stayed busy scavenging on land, the water and distance still worked for us. But logic said that once they ran out of easy ground, we were next on the menu. For a while, they didn't look our way. We tried to stay invisible. We burned only kiln-dried wood and kept the stove damper choked down so the smoke stayed thin. The generator ran only in short bursts during storms. The boat stayed pulled high in the inlet under a camouflage tarp. We stopped going to shore unless it was critical. Tracks on the strip of bank got raked out after every trip. The plan was to look like one more dead patch of trees, but looking back, I knew we were kidding ourselves. You can't cheat physics in sub-zero temperatures. Even dry wood throws a heat ripple against a gray sky, and eventually someone with a scope and time on their hands was going to spot the anomaly. When the sound of their chainsaws finally faded, I told the others we had dodged that pass only because they were tired and guessing. Rhett sat by the door, oiling the action of the Mossberg shotgun he'd brought with him, and watched the distant firelight. He shook his head and said, "They've hit every cabin they can walk to. Next is fuel and motors. After that, they look across the water and ask why one clump of trees never lights up at all. Hunger makes people real curious. The camp kept growing like a tumor. By the second week, at least a dozen people moved around that loop. They stacked wooden pallets as a windbreak and kept a barrel stove burning at the center, feeding it furniture. A man with a scoped deer rifle walked the edge of the parking lot near dusk, walking a perimeter. At night, their fire glowed orange through the trunks, and we heard short, angry arguments and single gunshots. We couldn't hear the words, but the rhythm was clear. Food and wood were already turning into reasons to kill each other. The first clear sign they had noticed more than empty docks came on a bitter cold morning with thin ice crusting the shallows. From the pine, I saw two of them at the end of their dock with rifles. They weren't watching the road or the woods. They were staring straight across the open water. One pointed a gloved hand along a line that would pass near our rock. The other nodded slowly, like he had just agreed to something he didn't want to do but couldn't avoid much longer. That afternoon, their skiff came out again, this time on a straight intercept line instead of hugging the bank. 3 people sat in it, bundled in mismatched heavy coats. The motor ran low and steady. We were in place when the sound reached the inlet. Nora took the binoculars at the narrow slit in the window boards. I set the rifle on its rest. Rhett sat just inside the door, the shotgun resting across his knees, a handful of shells on the floor beside him. The skiff slowed about 200 yards off the island, rocking in the chop, and the man in the bow raised his voice and shouted, "Cabin on the rock! We see your smoke! We're not here to start trouble, we want to talk." He knew we were watching. There was no point in hiding now. I stayed behind the boards, invisible in the shadow, and shouted back, "You've got your camp on shore. That's your ground. This is ours." He looked back at the others in the boat, then toward the cabin again, and answered, "Our ground is tents in the wind and shelves that get lighter every day. Yours is 4 walls, a roof, and a stash. We're not asking for a blessing. We're asking for a share." They had burned through what they could reach, and now they were looking at us not just as neighbors, but as a warehouse. I kept my voice level, trying not to give away how tight my grip was on the rifle stock. 3 people live here, I said. We planned for 3, not for a refugee camp. If we open this place up, we all run out together. That kills us, and it doesn't save you. The man in the bow shifted like he wanted to come closer, but didn't like the silence coming from our windows. He yelled, "You could come to us, bring your gear, fold in, more hands, more guns. Right now you're 3 people in a wooden box, 1 bad night, 1 breach, and you're gone." He believed that line. I believed in the freezing water and the reinforced boards between us and his camp. "We chose this rock because it's hard to reach," I said. "That's the only reason we're still breathing. I'm not walking into a ring of strangers where one lie about a fever or a bite gets us all killed. You keep your side, we keep ours." For a few seconds, only the slap of water against their hull made any sound, and then he tried once more, his voice harder this time. "Do the math," he shouted. "Think about what happens when the wood and food on this shore really run out. We're not going to lie down on the bank and quit. We're going to look at the one dry roof on this lake and decide what matters more. Your claim or our lives." He had just told us exactly who they were going to be when hunger pressed hard enough. I didn't dress it up. "Then this is where we stay," I said. "If you come back here again, it won't be to talk." The man stared at the trees for a long moment, calculating the odds, then tapped the driver's shoulder. The motor whined as it came up in pitch. The skiff turned and headed back toward the north shore. The wake spread in a thin, expanding line across the gray water and reached our rocks a minute later. It was a small thing, just another wave slapping the bank, but it meant the quiet part of the island's life was over, and we all knew the war had just started. The boats came for us on a clear, hard night when the wind had finally dropped, leaving the air so still that sound carried across the whole lake like it was traveling over glass. For 3 evenings, we had watched the black smoke rise from the shore camp and seen their trucks come and go on the access road, desperate and erratic. Nobody over there was packing up to leave. We knew the math. We added 1 more row of reinforced boards to the windows, checked the heavy door bar twice, and set the guns and spare magazines within arm's reach on the table. We agreed on one absolute rule. Once the motors started, nobody opened that door for anything less than fire. Thin ice had started to form in the sheltered coves, concentric white rings that cracked under the first wave of the morning. But out in the main channel, the water stayed open and black. Every morning I climbed the pine to make sure the gap was still there. It never froze between us and the north bank. If anyone wanted our cabin, they had to come on a boat, and they had to show themselves in open water with nowhere to hide. The sound reached us just after full dark. The whine of one small outboard motor running low and another falling in behind it, out of sync. I went to the viewing slit, set the rifle on its padded rest, and killed the lantern with my free hand, plunging us into darkness. Nora knelt by the side wall with her carbine ready, the barrel resting on a loop of strap. Rhett eased the drop bar into its deep pockets, sat with his back braced against the frame, and let the Mossberg shotgun rest across his knees. Nobody spoke. We just listened to the motors get louder, holding a straight line, not drifting left or right. 2 skiffs slid out of the haze on a direct vector from the picnic loop. The first carried 3 people, 1 hunched at the tiller and 2 forward with rifles across their laps. The second boat was overloaded with 4 men, hunched around packs and a long pump-action shotgun. They came inside the 100-yard mark and slowed, feeling for rocks and floating ice. When the lead skiff hit about 50 yards out, the man in the bow raised his voice, his breath pluming in the cold light, and said, "Cabin on the rock, last offer. You join us or we take what you have." I kept the crosshairs centered on his chest but shifted slightly down. I yelled back, voice flat, "Turn both boats around and go back right now. If you keep coming, we shoot." He gave a short, jagged laugh that echoed off the water and answered, "You're 3 people behind pine boards. We're 7 with nothing left to lose. You will run out of ammo long before we run out of bodies." Then he waved his free hand and shouted, "Bring it in!" Both motors roared as they throttled up, driving straight at the island's landing. There was nothing left to say. I shifted my aim from his chest to the bow of the first skiff, picked a spot just above the waterline where the aluminum was thinnest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard into my shoulder, the report deafening in the small room, and the hull of the lead boat rang like a struck pipe. Water surged into the nose through the jagged hole. The man in front dropped his gun to grab the rail as the boat dipped violently. The driver cut the motor in panic, and the skiff rolled, instantly swamping. It stuck there, half sunk, bow heavy and stern barely afloat. The second skiff jerked aside to miss the wreck and lost its clean line. Nora took one steady breath, picked the rear man in that boat, and fired twice. He toppled backward into the lake with a splash, his heavy pack dragging him down immediately. The cold hit him the second he went under. He surfaced once, flailing and gasping, clawing for the flooded hull of the first boat. The others in the second boat panicked and tried to suppress us from a tossing deck. Rounds punched splinters from our outer window boards and slammed into the heavy brace behind us, but none of them found flesh. Rhett waited for the lull, then leaned close to the narrow gap near the door and fired a single heavy slug. It smashed into the second boat's engine, cowling with a metallic crunch. The front gunner folded sideways, dropping his rifle, but before Rhett could rack the slide, a different sound rolled in from the north bank, low, rhythmic, and hard. Rippers had a sound you never forgot. Shufflers dragged their feet. Rippers hit the ground with short, heavy steps that never broke stride. The first crack of my .308 would have carried for miles. The shotgun blast and their wild return fire had been the dinner bell. The noise had traveled over the flat water and straight into the trees behind the picnic loop. Nora kept her eyes on the sights, but whispered, "They heard every bit of that up there." The boat motors cut almost together. Voices on the water went high and thin as the men in the boat stopped shooting and started yelling to pull for the rocks. We stayed off the triggers and listened. Shapes moved between the trunks and parked trucks on the far shore. Some bodies swayed and bumped into each other, shufflers, but others ran in straight, brutal lines. The flat stamp of ripper feet rolled over the lake like an extra heartbeat. The people in the drifting skiffs swung their rifles toward the shore and fired in short, scared bursts, but it didn't slow the ones running. The first rippers reached the water's edge, paced once along the bank, and then splashed into the shallows. They broke through the thin rim ice into knee-deep water and kept coming with a wall of shufflers stacking up behind them. The shore camp survivors had a choice, and they had no time. One man from the sinking boat jumped and tried to wade for a low rock, made it a couple of steps before his legs quit from the cold and went under. Another kept yanking on the starter cord of the second boat until he flooded the engine. The rest fired in all directions, screaming at each other while the cold water and the teeth waiting in the shallows finished what their greed had started. We just sat there and listened until the gunfire stopped and only low, wet sounds carried across the lake. The skiffs drifted, one half sunk, one hung up on a rock, and nobody stood in them. Nora stepped back from the slit, let out a long, shaky breath, and said, "They're finished." Rhett checked the door bar, his knuckles white, and answered, "Anybody left up there just learned exactly what this channel costs." I watched the empty boats bobbing in the dark and the shadows pacing the far bank and said, "We leave it alone tonight. Tomorrow we see what the lake pushes our way and what we are better off never touching." The morning after the fight broke clear and sharp, the kind of cold that snaps inside your nose. Thin, jagged ice hugged the rocks along the shoreline, but the stretch of open water between us and the north shore remained dark and deep. Through the binoculars, the picnic loop looked dead and gray. No smoke, no trucks, no movement on the access road. We walked down to the strip of gravel below the cabin and watched the two bandit skiffs drifting. The night wind had pushed them down lake, away from our inlet. One was half sunk in the ice, its bow pinned against a submerged stone. The other rode low in the water, but still floated. Bodies lay scattered on the far bank. A few of them still twitched in all the wrong ways. None of us wanted those boats washing up near our rocks. They were metal, fuel, and bad history wrapped in one package. Rhett watched them bob in the chop and said, "We should mark them. If some fool comes through here 3 months from now and tries to climb in to salvage a motor, they need to know what's inside before they touch it." We tied strips of bright orange surveyor's tape to a branch, waited for the wind to shift in our favor, and then took our boat out just far enough to reach the floating skiff. We stripped a few useful tools from it, looped the hazard tape around the bow line and stern, and pushed it away with a paddle. We came straight back without cutting the engine. Back inside the cabin, we turned our attention from the lake to the shelves. I added the few supplies Rhett had managed to fit in his waterproof case, along with the handful of cans and tools we had stripped from the bandit boat, and wrote clean rows of numbers in the notebook Nora kept by the stove. When I started to flip the page to start a new daily log, she laid a hand on it and said, "We do this by weeks now. Once the snow really sits on the roof, we want enough stacked in here that we only use the boat if something breaks or we're dying." We kept the survival math simple. 3 people, 2 meals a day, absolutely no idle snacking. The cans, rice, and beans would carry us into deep winter if we held the line and didn't get greedy. The lake could add fish when the weather allowed us to set lines through the ice. Coffee and sugar would run out first, and that would suck, but it wouldn't kill us. Running short on heat or clean water would. Heat fell to Rhett. He took it as his personal mission. He walked the island with a small bow saw, cutting fallen limbs that were still sound and dropping standing dead trees when he had to. I split what he dragged in, the maul ringing in the cold air, and stacked the pieces under a tarp he strung between the cabin wall and a pine. The pile grew into a low, reassuring wall. Each time we added a layer of oak or pine, the empty space by the stove felt like less of a gamble. Water duty landed on Nora. The hand pump filters worked fine, but filling small jugs meant too many freezing trips down to the inlet. On an early scavenge run during a quiet morning, she had spotted 2 sound blue rain barrels near the old public launch, and we had floated them back one at a time. We set them on a rough wooden stand above the cabin, ran a siphon hose through the wall to a tap by the door, and dug a shallow trench to carry the overflow away from our path. Now we had a gravity-fed reserve. Inside, we turned the room from a bare box into something we could actually live in without going crazy. The cot went to the back corner. We built 2 low platforms from scrap lumber for extra beds. Mattresses we had pulled from empty cabins on the near shore during the lull went on top. The 3 of us slept close to keep the body heat where it mattered. By the front wall, we built a narrow shelf for the ammunition, a battery lantern, and the radio. Two small crates with basic tools stayed under it, so if the door ever failed, we wouldn't be standing there empty-handed. We fixed the bathroom situation too. A shallow pit and a crate had been enough in warm weather, but winter would trap the smell and freeze the ground. Using dock planks and spare tarp, Rhett framed a small annex off the back wall with its own door and a vent pipe run higher than the roofline. We moved the seat inside and added a bucket with water and a little soap. It wasn't luxury, but it was civilized. Night settled into a hard pattern. One of us always stayed up for first watch at the narrow viewing slit, rifle or carbine within reach, while the other two slept. We listened for motors, for the flat, heavy stamp of rippers on the far shore, or for the dragging shuffle of dead feet over stone. Most nights, the only sounds were just the wind howling through the pines and the shifting ice groaning on the lake. On those mornings, the notebook got a short, grateful note. Quiet. No change. Lake clear. Now and then, the radio gave us scraps of the outside world. A thin, static-filled voice talked about a resistance moving north. Another read off coordinates and claimed there was a safe town in the mountains, then went silent mid-sentence. One looped recording told people to stay calm and wait for help that clearly wasn't coming. Each time the signal faded into white noise, Nora watched the dial for a second, then turned it back to the weather band. We talked about spring sometimes. If the roads opened up and the dead thinned out due to the freeze, we might risk a slow run along the far shore to see what was left of the world. Maybe the coordinates pointed to something real. Maybe they were just another ghost story. But for now, the island wasn't a stop on the way to somewhere else. It was the plan. From the outside, the cabin still looked like a box nobody wanted. The boards hid the windows completely. The smoke from the chimney stayed thin and wispy. No light leaked out after dark. The boat sat under its tarp, pulled high and quiet. From the highway or the old marina or the empty launch, our rock was just another clump of trees on gray water, and that was exactly how it had to stay if we wanted winter to end with our names still our own. There are 3 of us on the island now. Most days that feels like exactly the right number. Add anyone else and the shelves would go bare too fast. Any fewer, and the silence out here would start to feel like its own kind of threat. The lake gives us a buffer, plenty of space, but it doesn't make any promises. It just sits there, cold and black between us and the shore, waiting to see who runs out of time first. When I first started hauling lumber out here 3 years ago, I told people I was building a quiet place to fish and sleep off a hard week. That was the version I could tell at parties. The truth was that the town already felt wrong to me. Too many sirens, too many crowds, too many nights where my phone knew more about where I had been than I did. This cabin was a way to step out of that loop without having to explain myself to anyone. Back then, the island was just a nameless bump on an old chart. Technically, it still is, but now every board I nailed up has a survival purpose. The drop bar across the door keeps one bad shove at 3 in the morning from ending everything. The blankets stapled to the walls keep the heat in and the light out. The bathroom box keeps disease out of our water supply. The narrow shelf with the guns and tools by the front wall is where our hands go first if anything ever makes it through the wood and steel. We live by hard rules now. If you go outside at night, you say exactly where you are going and how long before you should be back. If you pick up a gun, you check the chamber twice and announce what it's loaded with so nobody has to guess in a panic. If someone says they hear something, we don't argue or roll our eyes. We get quiet and we listen. If boots ever hit the shore, we want to know about it before they find the path up the rise. The dead along the banks change with the season. Some lie where they dropped and freeze solid to the ground. Some wander in slow, jagged lines, turning toward any sound before drifting away again. Sometimes a caller settles near the picnic loop and starts making that broken, wet noise that pulls others in. And we mark that spot on Nora's chart and stay clear. Now and then, a ripper runs a side street, and that heavy hammering rhythm on the asphalt is enough to remind you why sleeping behind plate glass in town is a death sentence. If someone stumbles onto this place years from now, they might see nothing special. Just a weathered cabin on a rock with boards over the windows, a short dock that's half rotted, a pile of cut wood, and a vent pipe that doesn't smell like anything. They might not know that every nail and extra bracket is part of one singular idea. Stay off the lists. Stay off the screens. Stay far enough off the shore that nothing that walks can reach you without warning. I don't know how long this lasts. Maybe winter gives way to a spring where the dead slow down, and the living finally walk out of basements and closets to start drawing careful lines again. Maybe the infection burns low and turns into just one more scary story people tell at night. Or maybe it never ends, and this rock is just a decent place to sit through the long, slow collapse. None of that is my call. That's above my pay grade. What I can control is small and clear. Keep the stove fed. Keep the water clean. Keep the guns dry and the bar on the door set right. Help Nora keep her charts honest and help Rhett keep the woodpile higher than the fear that creeps in around 3 in the morning. When the fire drops and the wind shifts and some sound on the far shore makes you think about everything you can't see. For now, that is enough. We built a sanctuary on a lake island nobody knows about and turned it into a place that is still ours in a world that lost most of the rules it thought it had. As long as the water stays between us and the shore and the dead hate the deep as much as we used to love it, we have a chance. Thanks for listening. If you liked this story, hit like, subscribe for more survival logs, and comment down below where you're listening from. Stay safe, watch your shorelines, and remember that sometimes the best place to be is the one nobody bothered to put on the map. Out there tonight.